Good day, students, and welcome to week 2 of SPED 185. We are still on module 1, Special Needs and Inclusion, and this week we'll be looking at the following objectives. 1. To identify and describe key laws and policies that focus on children with special needs. 2. To value the rights and responsibilities of government and educators towards children with a variety of needs and from diverse backgrounds. 3. To understand the importance of ethical standards in special education service provision. 4. We're going to propose ways in which policies can improve the provision and practice of education to children with special needs. And 5. To identify key issues affecting special education and inclusion. Now, in last week's session, we would have learned that inclusion involves all kinds of practices that ultimately are practices of good teaching and that would cater to the needs of the diverse learners in the general education setting. As we would have covered the history of special education as well, we would have gone away with the understanding that in the very early years, special education service provision was not afforded to persons with disabilities. And it's important to note that as a result of litigation and advocacy, both on the part of the parents as well as the wider community, over the years, various laws and policies have been implemented around the world that speak specifically to people's rights. Now, there is a difference between a law and a policy, and in different countries, you'll find that there are laws, especially as it relates to education. A country might have an Education Act, which is their law, and then there would be policies. The difference between a law and a policy is that the law is enforced at a governmental level, and therefore it must be followed. So the law refers to rules that govern behavior, and a policy, on the other hand, is just a statement of intent. So it's enforced at an institutional level. Therefore, deviations can occur. Now, as educators, you must be cognizant of all the barriers that have deprived children of equal educational opportunity in the past. And so, you must understand the importance of your role now as an educator and being willing to follow and implement and uphold the laws and policies that have been outlined. The major laws that affect special education relate to the following goals: equal opportunity, full participation, economic independence, and independent living. Here in the Caribbean, most of our laws and policies follow in line with what happens in the United States of America, simply because they are within close proximity to us, as well as because they're a developed nation and because many of the countries in the Caribbean are of developing nation status. We look to the United States for best practices. And so in the United States, there are a number of laws that protect the rights of persons with disabilities and that guide educational practice. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is one of the most significant. It was reauthorized several times. It started off in 1975 as the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and the most recent reauthorization came about in 2004. Now, IDEA is based on a number of principles that we would look at just now, 6 principles in particular, and it focuses on accountability, it focuses on service provision for persons with disabilities, it focuses on equality and equity. And we would look at the distinction also between equality and equity in a bit. In the United States, there is also the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. And I'm sure that you would have heard of this concept of no child being left behind, as well as they have a civil rights law, which is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which provides additional services and benefits for students who may not qualify under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So students who may not qualify for service provision, Section 504 provides them with additional services. Now, the 6 principles that IDEA is based on are zero reject. This means that no child can be denied an education. So no one can tell the parent that a child has such a severe disability. No one can say that a child is uneducable. All children must be accepted into schools. The second principle, non-discriminatory evaluation. This means that the assessments that are used to determine if a child has a disability, those assessments must be fair and it must not contain any sort of bias to affect the results of the evaluation in any way. Free appropriate education says that students should not have to pay to receive schooling. That's the part that deals with free and appropriate, meaning that the education that is provided to the child must meet their specific needs. The least restrictive environment is built on the premise that the child's placement is the general education setting. That's where the child belongs in the first instance, and accommodations and modifications should be given to meet the child's specific needs. And only when that environment is not the best for the child, meaning that the child is not doing well given the accommodations and modifications, then other options can be sought out. And we'll be looking at least restrictive environment in Module 4. Procedural due process has to deal with the following of proper guidelines for decision makings. And then procedural due process says that when a party is not pleased, meaning when the parents are not pleased with the decisions that have been made, if the school is not pleased, then this outlines specific guidelines for dealing with disagreements. Family and student participation, which is the 6th principle that IDEA is based on. It means that the parent and the students should have input and be a part of the planning process for the needs of the child. And in this way, the child's likes and dislikes and strengths and weaknesses and even the family's goals in terms of the outcomes for the child would be taken into consideration. So we've looked at this international law as it relates to the US and what they provide and prescribe for educational services for their students as well as for those with disabilities. Internationally, there are a number of policies that have been outlined, and countries around the world are advised to follow these practices. Here in the Caribbean, we also adhere to best practices for human rights as determined by the United Nations. The United Nations is an international body which was established in 1945 that is aimed at promoting international cooperation. And they have proposed some policies. Some of them are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, as well as the Salamanca Statement. Let's take a look at the Convention on the Rights of a Child. Now, this sets out the basic human rights that are entitled for children all over the world. It was drafted in 1989 and came into being in 1990. And there are 54 articles that speak specifically to the rights of all children. And that would include everyone between the ages of 0 to 18. The Convention on the Rights of the Child was ratified by a number of countries, including those in the Caribbean. Antigua and Barbuda is one of the countries that have agreed that they would follow the principles that are set out in the Convention of the Rights of a Child. This document establishes a direct relationship between the state and the child, and therefore means that as a classroom teacher, it is your responsibility to enforce the rights that the convention has prescribed. Given that your country, Antigua and Barbuda, has agreed to follow these rights. The Salamanca Statement and Framework for Action is another that has been set out by the United Nations. It came into being in 1994, and it calls for a commitment for education for all. It recognizes the urgency and the need for providing education for all children, and it says that inclusive environments are beneficial, and thus Caribbean member states have agreed to implement inclusive education in their own country. So best practice internationally in terms of what laws developed countries have outlined, as well as policies that have been set out by the United Nations, have all influenced our practice here in the Caribbean. Specifically for Antigua and Barbuda, your Education Act of 2008 says that the education system must be there to provide opportunities to maximize the potential of students. It must include special education planning. Your Education Act also says that a special ed program should be delivered in the least restrictive environment. It says that specific and individual needs of students should be taken into consideration and that individual learning plans should be provided for them. And it also mentions the following of due process. Antigua and Barbuda also has a draft special education policy of 2013, and it defines special needs. It says how it should be identified and assessed and what provisions, what guidelines and practices must be implemented. These will all be posted on the website for you to go through. So let's talk about ethics in special education and inclusion. Ethics involve understanding your role as a teacher, acting as a model, as well as giving a commitment to enabling inclusion to occur. Ethical practice involves using accommodations and modifications, accommodations being altering the environment or the curriculum and equipment so that it would meet the needs of the student with a disability so that they can participate. And modifications refer to changes in the curriculum. So in that way, the student is not following the general education curriculum, but another curriculum is set out to meet the student's learning needs. There are a number of ethical principles that have been prescribed by the Council for Exceptional Children, and they relate to maintaining challenging expectation, professional competence, inclusive participation, being collegial, developing relationships with families, using evidence-based practice, as well as a number of other principles. Now listed on the screen here are some issues that affect inclusive education, and relating to the principles that we just went through, a number of other issues can arise. I encourage you to read the written lecture notes and learn more about the issues in special education. I want you to start thinking about it. Should special education provision be equal or equitable? Equality refers to sameness, so should all students get the same thing? Or should it be fair and should they be given what they need for their specific disability? Go on the forum, participate in this week's discussion, and have a read of the lecture notes. Remember, diversity is the mix and inclusion makes it work.